Housing crisis or capitalist crisis, anti-gentrification, the left. This event is part of a broader series of events that are happening only today and last night. The Platypus Affiliated Society's European Conference in 2018. I'm going to say a few words about Platypus. I'm going to talk about our activities very quickly at Goldsmiths and LSE, and then I'm going to read the panel description and the questions for this event, and I'm going to introduce the speakers. The Platypus Affiliated Society organises reading groups, public fora, research and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old, new, post-political left, for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. We ask what the left has been and what it can yet become. Through our public fora and journalism, we bring together various tendencies, groups and individuals to host the absent but necessary conversations about the depth of the left, to consider its possible reconstitution today. At Goldsmiths, we host weekly coffee breaks on Mondays from 5 to 6 p.m. at 35 Cafe, and a weekly reading group on Sundays from 1 to 4 p.m. in this building in room 257. Please feel free to take copies of the free open submission Platypus Review, which is published monthly at the table at the entrance. This weekend is the European Conference, and also at the door are copies of the schedule for this. There are two more events, as you can see here, today, and there's a teach-in from Boris Kargalitsky tomorrow. And there's a change of time on the timetable. It says 1 p.m., but it's actually starting at 2 p.m. We also have a chapter at LSE, where we host a weekly reading group on Tuesdays from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. on a weekly basis on Wednesdays. And a weekly coffee break on Wednesdays from 6 to 7 p.m. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the description and questions. I'm just going to read that out quickly for this event to contextualize the event. In recent years, a significant current of left activists and thinkers has sought to mobilise around issues relating to urban change, most notably housing provision. Much activity has involved resisting gentrification, the economic displacement of marginalised communities, and lobbying established political parties such as Labour for investment in social housing or for rent controls. Since Engels wrote about the housing condition of the English working class in the 1840s, political changes in capitalism have seen different forms of state management of the housing issue, yet it remains a symptom of the crisis of capitalism. How have these political struggles of the past, the struggles for better housing, more equitable planning, against neoliberalism and against gentrification, how have these struggles responded or related to the struggle for socialism and for the pursuit of freedom? How could they advance the struggle for socialism and the freedom of the present, the pursuit of freedom in the present? And here's the questions for the panelists. What is gentrification? How do you understand this term? What significance has it had and should it have for the left? How do housing struggles in the present relate to those of the past? Why does capitalism appear to produce a housing crisis? Can it be solved in capitalism? How has the housing problem changed in the history of capitalism? How has the left changed in relation to this history? In what way was the post-war provision of social housing and urban renewal, banning issues of slum clearance, for example, considered socialist or not? How and why did the new left of the 60s and 70s take up urban geography and housing? And finally, how do campaigns around housing relate to the struggle for socialism? How does this task relate to today? And I'm going to introduce the speakers. So first we have, on my right here, on the far left, Simon Elmer, who is the co-founder of Architects for Social Housing, which was set up in March 2015 to offer an architectural response to London's so-called housing crisis. Over the past 3 years, ASH has developed alternatives to demolition for 6 housing estates that increase their housing capacity by up to 45% without demolishing a single home and generate the funds to refurbish the existing homes. In addition, ASH have published around 140 articles on UK housing and practice, including a dozen case studies of individual estate regeneration, submissions on the government's housing and planning bill, and the London Mayor's Good Practice Guide to Estate Regeneration, and his widely read report on the Grenfell Tower fire. last year ASH undertook to produce the first map of London's estate regeneration programme, locating some 237 estates that have recently undergone, are currently undergoing, or are threatened with regeneration, demolition or privatisation, with the resulting loss of homes for social rent, 195 of which are in Labour-run boroughs. From its founding, ASH has been critical of the role of Labour councils in implementing the estate regeneration programme, and over the past 2 years has commented at length on Labour housing policy. Next on the right is Matthew Lee, and by the way, the speaker is going to speak in this order. So, Matthew Lee is a first-year student at UCL studying politics and Eastern European studies. He has a background in the Italian squatting and social centre activism, but recently got more majorly involved in housing activism, specifically in London, back in the end of September last year. He is an organiser and activist for UCL Cut the Rent, a radical student campaign organising rent strikes and other actions to force the university to reduce the rent at their halls of residence. On top of that, Matthew was part of the group that occupied London College of Communication in January for a week in an effort to make them pull out of a development that would socially cleanse the area in Elephant and Castle, which was partially successful, but this very much is still an ongoing struggle. So today Matthew is speaking on behalf of the organisation called Stop the Elephant Development, which is trying to resist this plan of redevelopment of a shopping centre. Austin Williams, on the right, on the far left, sorry, is the director of the Future Cities project and author of China's Urban Revolution. He is also the co-author of The Lure of the City and founder of Mantown Human, a manifesto towards a new humanism in architecture. And there's a spare seat for Sasha Ismail from the Alliance Workers' Liberty, who I was expecting to speak today, but isn't here. I'm not sure, he might possibly walk in during the event. Okay, so without further ado, I want to ask Simon to please, I'm going to say that if the speakers could try and speak for a maximum of 12 minutes, around 12 minutes please, that would be great.
Thanks for having me here. We're actually called Ash. Just because I'm going to refer to it. Okay, these questions pose for possible discussion on the panel. Even if I was qualified to try and answer all of them, it would take up probably the rest of this day. So I just want to focus on one of these questions that David posed, which I think is coming into sharper focus in the UK, and which relates most closely to what have been Ash's attempts to propose alternatives to London's estate regeneration programme. This question is, why does capitalism appear to produce a housing crisis? And can it be solved in capitalism? I chose this question first because by proposing that our current housing crisis has been produced, it refuses this discourse of crisis by which we have been paralysed, and which has made us accept, I think uncritically and without question, the so-called solutions proposed to solve this crisis, rather than challenging the ends to which it has been produced. One only has to recall that the same terminology has been applied to the financial crisis, the deficit crisis, the benefits crisis, the NHS crisis, the education crisis, the population crisis, and the mother of all crises, the environmental crisis, to understand something about how this discourse of crisis acts as an instrument of privatisation. But I also chose this question because it questions the extent to which the so-called solutions to the housing crisis are in fact producing and reproducing the very crisis they've been proposed in order to solve. And in doing so, it understands our housing crisis not as a failure of capitalism, but this particular instance of that seemingly eternally recurring crisis to which it has been doomed almost since its inception, but rather as the instrument of capitalism's latest colonisation of what housing activists inaccurately describe as a human right.
Indeed, if we wish to understand the mutation capitalism is undergoing as it shifts on its global axis, we could do worse than examine London's housing crisis. The first thing I'd say in answer then, which I wrote about in an article called The London Clearances in 2015, is that there is no housing crisis, if by crisis we mean something that is out of our control. On the contrary, the shortage of housing and the corresponding boom in UK house prices and rents has been, in fact, carefully prepared and legislated for over a number of years to serve the interests and fill the pockets of those who have the most to gain from it, both politically and economically. There is, in actuality, rather than the ideology of our society, a class war being waged through housing. And so far, it is all going to plan. Far from being out of our control, the housing crisis is well in hand. The question of why capitalism produces a housing crisis, I don't think there's any appeal about it. I won't answer, as in its essentials it has already been answered in the series of articles titled The Housing Question, which were published between 1872 and 73 by Friedrich Engels, whose observations on the inconvenient trajectory of capitalism gave its name to the Platypus Society, I understand. So accurately do these articles describe not only the causes of our current housing crisis, but also the full solutions proposed to solve it, that in 2016 Ash published excerpts on our blog illustrated with photographs of some of the effects of these solutions. And in this text, which I recommend to anyone here who's interested in the housing crisis, Engels is unequivocal about its causes. He says, the real answer to this question, he writes, is that capital does not want to abolish the housing shortage, even if it could. If I may, I'd go even further and say that capitalism needs a housing shortage. And this is nowhere more true today than in the UK. The estimated total value of the UK housing stock in January 2017 was £6.8 trillion, and that had increased by 1.5 trillion in the previous 3 years alone. It's equivalent to 3.7 times our gross domestic product and nearly 60% of the UK's entire net wealth. The housing market now constitutes an economy in itself, much larger than the GDP of many European countries. Nobody will be surprised to hear that £1.7 trillion of that housing stock is in London. According to the 2016 Sunday Times Rich List, 26 of the 100 wealthiest people in the UK listed property as a major source of their wealth. While among the richest 1,000 people in the UK, there are 164 property moguls with a combined wealth of 143.7 billion. As for where that property wealth is coming from, the pre-tax profits of the four largest builders in the UK, that is Persimmon Homes, Taylor Wimpey, Barratt Homes and the Berkeley Group, rose from just under £419 million in 2011 to over £2.6 billion in 2016. That's a six-fold increase in 5 years. We've all heard about the CEO of Persimmon, who's about to be paid a £120 million bonus. Hardly surprisingly, given these figures, London house prices have risen by 86% since 2009, and at an average asking price of about £600,000, now costs more than 17 times the average London salary of £35,000. In inner London, that price rises to around £970,000. Home ownership in the UK, which peaked at 71% in 2003, has been declining ever since and now stands at 63%, with only 40% of Londoners predicted to own their own home by 2025. Meanwhile, rents on London's private market, which 20% of British households now live in, have risen to an average of £1,730 per month for a two-bedroom home, which is more than twice the national average. The total rent paid by UK tenants last year rose to £51.6 billion, and that's more than double the £22.6 billion paid as recently as 2007. Millennials, which was born between 1997 and 1995, paid £30.2 billion of that rent, which is more than 3 times the £9.7 billion they paid again in 2007. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation has predicted that over the next quarter of a century, rents will rise at twice the rate of incomes, and renters will be twice as likely to live in poverty. As a result of this huge escalation in the cost of housing, at the end of last year, the charity Shelter estimated that there are now 307,000 people in Britain who are homeless. That means either accommodated in temporary housing, in bed and breakfasts or homeless hostels, or sleeping rough. That's 1 in every 208 people in the UK population. In London, where 165,000 of those people are homeless, that figure rises to 1 in every 59. These numbers, however, don't include the hidden homeless, with an estimated 1 in 5 people under the age of 25 having couch surfed over the past year, 250,000 of them in London. This trend is predicted to increase, with Shelter warning that more than 1 million UK households are at risk of becoming homeless in 2020. Across Britain, the homes of 41% of semi-skilled and unskilled workers, and 31% of skilled workers fail to meet shelter's new living home standard, while in London 56% of all homes fail to meet this criterion of affordability. So the housing crisis, in other words, is a crisis not of supply, but of affordability. And this brings me to the second part of the question, which is whether the housing crisis can be solved under capitalism. Even within the fine gradations of neoliberalism that differentiate the major political parties in the UK, at the last general election, the manifesto pledges on housing, published by the Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat parties, shared a remarkable consensus that the solution to the housing crisis was a massive programme of new build housing developments. In fact, there's nothing remarkable about it, given that all three parties draw on the same reports produced by the same think tanks, headed by the same directors of the same housing associations, under the sponsorship of the same building companies and estate agents. And what they all promised was that, if elected to the government of the UK, they would build 1 million new homes over the next Parliament. By doing so, they all agreed, they would not only provide the homes Londoners' present and future need, but also, according to this oft-quoted law of supply and demand, drive the price of that housing down. The trouble with this programme, this pledge, which industry professionals have all agreed is impossible to meet anyway, is that while the law of supply and demand describes a capitalist myth of competitive markets responding to human needs, London's financialised housing market, flooded by global capital, is driven by profit margins. More than 100,000 UK land titles are registered to anonymous companies in British overseas territories, such as the Virgin Islands. Transparency International has been unable to identify the real owners of more than half of the 44,000 land titles registered to overseas companies, but 9 out of 10 of the properties were bought through tax havens. An extraordinary 30% of properties sold in London last year were bought by overseas investors. At the high end of the market, that increases to over 50%. Building more homes, more properties rather, for capital investment and for buy-to-let has pushed and will continue to push house and rental prices up. And yet, that is precisely what the councils, housing associations, property developers, estate agents, architects and builders, given the task of solving the house crisis, are doing. 59% of demand in London is for lower mainstream properties. That means £450 per square foot or below £315,000 for a property, and for properties for sub-market rent. But only a quarter of the roughly 38,500 properties currently being built will go on sale for this price. Instead, last year builders started work on 1,900 properties priced at more than £1,500 per square foot, more than 3 times as much, and only 900 of which had sold by 2018. As of January this year, there are an additional 14,000 unsold lower prime properties in the market for between 1,000 and 1,500 per square foot. By contrast, in the year ending March 2016, just 6,550 homes for social rent were built across the whole of England, and not a single such home was built in London in the year October 2017. So I'm nearly finished now. So even though he was writing about a London housing market a century and a half old, Engels has already answered this question for us. And he says, capitalists have only one method of settling the housing question, after their fashion, which is to say, by settling it in such a way that the solution continually reposes the question. Now, from the refusal to see in this perpetual recreation of cause and effect, the systemic recreation of capitalism by itself, comes all the moralistic explanations of the housing crisis that try to explain it away by references to the greed of a few capitalists or the cruelty of the government. We have no shortage of such explanations today from the mouths of so-called left-wing politicians who sell something they call capitalism for the many, not the few, and whose proposed solutions to the housing crisis are in practice reproducing and multiplying its effects. The estate regeneration programme, which is the basis of the housing policies of both the Labour and the Conservative parties, and which is systematically replacing the UK's council and social housing with properties built and priced according to the demands of the market, is the primary instrument of this reproduction. So, in response to this larger question, which we convene to ask, housing crisis or capitalist crisis, my answer is neither. The housing poverty and homelessness into which increasing numbers of the UK population are being driven are the products of the success of capitalism, not the symptoms of its failure. Thank you.
First off, I'd like to apologise that I haven't had much time to prepare this. I only got this brief last night, so I may not be able to speak as eloquently and for as long as my friend here on the left. But nonetheless, I'd just like to start off by talking about what the campaigns which I'm currently involved in are doing and how these relate to historical tactics and socialism in general and the struggle for socialism. So for a bit more info on the occupation and the Stop the Elephant Development campaign, we're currently the student-led wing focusing on the University Arts of London's involvement in the Delancey development currently happening in Elephant and Castle in Southwark. Essentially, this is a housing development which is going to knock down a shopping centre and the London College of Communications, which is part of the University Arts London. The shopping centre is majoritarily owned by Latino and Latina shop owners, and it's very much the heart of the community. One of the only few places in central London which still has affordable rents for independent shopkeepers and, affordable prices for the people who live there. Whereas this new development plans to not only not offer any sort of compensation to these shop owners or the local community, but also is only providing 3% social housing in its offer, with only 60 units in this 1,100 unit development being able to be afforded on the living wage in London, which, as we know, most people don't even have. So obviously there's a problem. In Southwark, technically, the council, which is a Labour council, although Blairite, if I say, you're meant to have 50% social housing in any new development. This has already been reduced in Elephant and Castle to encourage developers, which, quite frankly, are not welcome in the area by local people. It's been reduced to 35%. So obviously 3% is just an insult to this. And we have to ask sort of why this has been allowed and how you can have these regulations and regulations of capitalism and a capitalist housing market, which allows for this situation to happen where, these regulations are breached. And that's because, quite frankly, wherever there are regulations and wherever there is a market, the forces in this market are going to find ways to get around those regulations. So for in this instance, the Delancey Corporation, which is an offshore development company, has managed to get around this by working with the university, and that so-called counts as community engagement, even though the university, quite frankly, the majority of students are opposed to this. Is only really the head of the university who is sort of art-washing this whole project to try and make it acceptable. So, obviously there is a failure even within left-wing reformists within capitalism, and obviously social housing and capitalism are not compatible in this situation. So, sort of, how do we act in this, and how do we deal with this? And the current campaigns which are happening, there are various different campaigns within this specific situation. So, for example, Stop the Elephant Development, the student wing, like I mentioned before, but also you have Up the Elephant, you have Latinx Elephant, which is the shopkeepers campaign. You have people involved in the Aylesbury estate campaigns, people who were involved in squatting up the Haygate estate a few years back, which ultimately failed, unfortunately. And there is a deep history of sort of housing activists which originally had stayed separate, and anti-gentrification, anti-social cleansing activists, which had stayed separate within the area, now all coming together for this project. And I think that is something which resembles largely in the struggle for socialism also, in the sense that you cannot just simply focus on one area and focus within a certain group. You have to expand into multiple different areas. You have to have a pluralist sort of way of tactics. You have to organize with different groups while still very much focusing on your specific area of expertise and doing what you can, what you have the best ability to do. So for us as students, we're not members of the local community, really. Personally, I've never lived in Southwark. I don't really go there that often. I only really have links to this through friends who are involved in this campaign, and that's how I got involved. But I do have a history of knowing how to, push universities to pull out of projects. For example, we've taken very much the history of the Carpenters Estate, which happened in Stratford up in 2013, in which UCL was hoping to expand, was going to knock down this estate, which had 3,000 units of social housing, very important to an area which had been increasingly socially cleansed. And through various occupations, various direct actions against the university, you were able to get that stop. You found the source of the power, which was the university, and you directly targeted it, and you're not solving this crisis, but you're helping it stop getting a lot worse. And I think that is sort of the relationship between the housing crisis and socialism as a whole. Very much I would agree that you cannot solve the housing crisis without solving capitalism in general. This is very much a capitalist-made crisis. We have, more housing in this country than we need. And it is, in fact, even illogical for the capitalists themselves to create this crisis, to push working people out of their homes, to create housing which is not being lived in, but rather just a physical manifestation of wealth creation and wealth investment by capitalists all over the world. And, Marx talks about this in Capital quite well. He talks about how, even though in a lot of cases it is illogical for capitalists to create these crises and to act in such a way, it's simply impossible for them not to. It is very much systematic within capitalism that you have to compete, you have to continue creating capital, you have to continue creating wealth, if you will, in order to compete with competitors, in order to survive as a capitalist. And, David Graeber, who is, I think, a wonderful professor who teaches actually here at Goldsmiths, gave a good example in a piece he did a few years back, where he talks about within the fossil fuel industry in Canada, these companies soared to the extent to which they are destroying the earth. They saw how unsustainable what they're doing was, how unsustainable their pursuit of capital was, and they know that they couldn't stop it. You had executives from these companies going to the Canadian government and saying, please put regulations in place before we destroy this country, before we destroy this earth. So you have to ask, what actually can reformation and government regulations of capitalism can do? And the answer is quite not a lot. It's failed again and again throughout history, and we're finding that increasingly within campaigns and within the supposed struggle for socialism, particularly in the UK, we're not focusing on progressing, but rather fighting back at the problems which capitalism keeps throwing at us. Much of the housing crisis and much of housing activism is not based upon us fighting for better housing conditions, us fighting for more housing based upon community mutual aid and solidarity, but it's rather pushing back at the problems which capitalism keeps pushing at us, such as social cleansing, like I've already mentioned, and people being pushed out of their homes falling into disrepair and not being maintained well enough, landlords increasing rent. For example, as I mentioned before, I'm a part of the Cut the Rent campaign at UCL, and although we've been fighting for years and we've been putting on rent strikes at the university, our victories have unfortunately mostly been rent freezes. They've not been decreases in rent. We've only had a decrease in rent in 2 of our many halls. Very much, I think the left and those who struggle for socialism in whatever form it may it be anarcho-communism or some sort of state socialism, you have to start fighting for these issues within a more pluralistic way. You have to fight with them in combination with the general fight against capitalism, because otherwise this struggle is just going to continue going on. And you may win campaigns, you may stop the gentrification of an area, you may, get rents to be frozen for however many years. But the issue is, in a few years' time, you're just going to have to repeat those struggles. No progress is being made, and ultimately that's what the struggle for socialism is about. It is about progress. It's not about simply trying to maintain the conditions which have been already won. You have to keep pushing for more. And I think that is a real problem within housing activism, particularly anti-gentrification activism, is we're not pushing for us to have better, to end capitalism and to end the crisis which capitalism has caused within housing, but simply is a fight against the offensive which capitalism has put at us. So, yeah, in conclusion, in short, sorry for rambling on a bit, I think the left needs to cooperate, it needs to take action, it needs to start making itself into an offensive operation rather than a defensive operation against capitalism, as we have, I think, seen. It needs to, occupy, it needs to push, it needs to create solidarity networks, it needs to do all these things, it needs to, not burn out, it needs to keep on acting in a way which very much puts the fire at the capitalist gates rather than trying to protect ourselves from what the capitalists are doing to us. Yeah.
Yeah. As with all these things coming last, I've got lots of agreements and several disagreements with what's just been said, but I'll plough on with what I've kind of formulated over the last few hours from early morning, and just lay out some principles, I think, which is like a conversation about what my left-wing perspective is and where we agree and where we disagree as part of an open conversation. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for inviting me. I've just come back from living in China for 6 years. I was teaching architecture, as it happens, in a university in China. And I know that there's a lot of very interesting, weird and wonderful left-wing groups here. Now, I'm not a Maoist. As a matter of fact, I'm a staunch critic of China. So don't get me wrong. But it is interesting to see the way that some of the cherished notions of left-wing politics, if you like, state division, social housing, progress, you mentioned, development, all these kind of things, how they play themselves out in another country. And it's slightly opened my eyes a little bit more, even when I came back, to think a bit more critically about what we mean by some of these concepts and whether we hold them daily as an orthodoxy or whether we can maybe start to challenge some of their principles. First off, I would probably say that as a general comment, and it is a general comment, it's striking that in China, gentrification is not a dirty word. I mean, first of all, there isn't a word for gentrification in China, but let's pretend that there is. The idea of gentrification is not a dirty word. It's basically social progress. It's about emerging towns and cities. It's about people craving social improvement and a route out of poverty. So this whole discussion really doesn't happen. In some ways, I mean, if you saw pictures of the Spring Festival TV show with a blackface performer, I don't know if you saw that. It's a big scandal in China at the moment. China is about 40 years, 50 years behind the times in many respects, admittedly maybe 20 years ahead of the times in others. But in some ways, some of these discussions about social housing and gentrification haven't really caught up to the way that we see it. And maybe all the better for that. Remember that in China practically everything is social housing, everything is state sector. Even the private sector is state sector. And most of it is beyond the reach of ordinary people's pockets. And the other thing to remember is that built by the state doesn't mean it's any good, which again is a very nice comparison with the UK. So I don't think we necessarily have to kind of celebrate it particularly. The desire for social improvement by any means necessary in a society that tends to regulate opportunities for individualistic advancement means that gentrification is a pragmatic option. Okay, that's my starting point. And it reminded me when I was thinking about it for this talk about when I first moved to Newcastle. I'm from South Wales originally, but when I moved to Newcastle in the 1980s, my introduction to Newcastle was going along the Scotswood Road, and there was a brutalist concrete block there with a gigantic banner saying, "Get us out of this hell." I always remember it. I thought, what the hell have I come to? And they kind of, that was when gentrification was good. That's when regeneration hadn't become a dirty word either. And they wanted improvements. They wanted to move, or rather, I think the prospect of moving didn't hold any fear for them. The prospect of having their homes demolished and moving on and getting somewhere better was actually something which, the idea of community wasn't kind of a stultifying concept that I think maybe it is today in many and too many respects. Those people at the time wanted to have social improvements. In general, what used to be the case that if there was in 1980s, very tumultuous times compared to kind of fairly static, apolitical, boring times that we live in today, but there was kind of a broader vision about what maybe society, whether in as a general political project or whether within its aspects, housing or whatever, had to offer. And I think that the idea of local authorities today craving cash, private landlords marketising their capital, ordinary people becoming pawns rather than social actors today, objects of history rather than subjects of history, notwithstanding what's been said already. I think that once you appreciate that, then disruption becomes a destabilising force to people's lives, and stability is craved. Disruption is something to be avoided. And I think it's very interesting about the Brexit campaign, which is quite telling, I think, that once you have something which is so important as to be beyond your individual experience, people are politically motivated to make choices where they aspire to higher ideals than themselves. People are fully prepared to endure hardship, which may or may not come as a result of Brexit. They're prepared to challenge the sanctity of established communities for higher values. So I think that there's a social environment, a social milieu, discourse, which I think needs to be challenged today, which maybe didn't happen in the past. I think the idea of Corbyn arguing that councils have to win ballots from existing tenants if any redevelopment is supposed to take place, these kind of technocratic things are quite evasive and quite opportunistic. I don't think they represent necessarily democratic mandates particularly. And I think weaponising the issue of housing activism is not necessarily going to lead to a dynamic reinvigoration of politics. Rather, it'll be the other way around, I think. I don't think I think it's going to be potentially akin to embryonic class consciousness since we're in this room, but I fear it's going to be more like conservationism, conservatism. Often these things end up being a recipe for stasis rather than activism. So gentrification in this country has got this kind of negative connotation. It's almost by definition. It's a bit like saying that if you're against sustainability, that means you're for unsustainability. So I think gentrification is one of those words that you can't possibly be for anymore. Hugh Pearman, the architectural critic, calls it a boo word, and he says that it's used to imply that a badly run-down area is some kind of affordable paradise that shouldn't be touched. And I share that worry, to be honest with you. I share the idea that the ambition for social improvement is downgraded in a policy discourse predetermined by suspicion, a suspicion of intentions of local authorities, of big business, of lend-lease, all these kind of people, maybe justifiably. But in some ways, this kind of nervousness and suspicion cannot be a positive model. I think the cynicism has its downsides. If we're cynical about the motivations of all these things, I think we become slightly problematic. The concept of democratic accountability, of progress and social mobility, and it also risks undermining the solidarities that we talk about as necessary for combating these very things. As Simon says, many times these things reinforce themselves rather than solve the problem. In the Western frame of reference, public sector, social housing, council housing, all these things are seized on as inherently good. I don't necessarily think that they are. It's developing a bit of a mythology, which is the equivalent of the NHS. It's almost like if you criticise the NHS, it's just like slapping a nurse in this country. And I think the same thing as the mantra of social housing. We have to maybe be a little bit distant from it and be critical where it deserves it. The state provision can be crap. And it reminds me that I think that it's not necessarily that gentrification is the problem, but again the opposite, or slightly tangential, that the concentration of poverty is the problem. The lack of options for people. In many ways, that comes with poverty. So in some ways, it's a social question that we're trying to discuss here rather than the fetishization of housing. And you can't wish these things away. I would even go so far as to say that when it comes to people who live in rented sector council housing, that's a kind of, they don't enjoy the same rights as private ownership does, by definition. Yes, it's a privilege rather than a right. So therefore, they are going to be less stable. They are going to be more prone to eviction, partly because that's the way it is. We might not like it, and I don't like it, but that's the case, I think. So I finally wanted to go through a couple of headings, if that's all right. How much time have I got?
You've got about 4 minutes.
Have I? Okay, right, I'll whiz through. I'm a modernist, and I think that the idea of universal provision is now seen politically and philosophically as a problem, the idea of universalism. And it comes from the fact that we're often enjoined to celebrate diversity rather than what makes us communal. So I think that there's something we need to tackle in terms of politics there, how we frame this. Modernism was, the end of the old order. It was an era of social transformation, and it reflected an ambition for more liberty. We often look at China saying that they've lifted 500 million people out of poverty in the last 20 years, which is true in some respects. But we don't really necessarily analyse the tragedies on an individualistic level. We see that as a social, universalizing benefit of social transformation. Whether you think that's good or bad is up for discussion. My contention is that, contemporary era of kind of general miserabilism in society, illiberalism, anti-humanism, pro-environmentalism, precautionary misanthropy, blah, 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 all these kind of things, I think we need a bit more of a critical engagement with some of those issues. Which takes me on to progress, if I may. Progress, which you've mentioned, Matthew, I agree with. I wrote a book called The Enemies of Progress exactly 10 years ago, which identified the creep of social and aspirational restraint within the discourse of sustainability, of environmentalism. Don't do things today in case they cause harm to future generations. That's a policy of low ambitions, minimum disruption. And that's what I'm worried about. George Monbiot, the environmentalist, says environmentalism is a campaign not for abundance but for austerity. Therein lies a problem for me. So for me, from that springs a notion that we should build less, not build more. And I really have a problem with that. How can you argue for more housing if you identify that housing is the biggest cause of CO2 emissions? How can you argue for social housing if you say, as Shelter does, that children living in social housing have more mental disorder problems? It's easier to pay for a psychiatrist than to build a house. More housing is difficult to advocate if we want to protect nature from concrete. And more housing is problematic if we say we want to conserve communities rather than maybe see these things as a social form in flux. So real healthy communities, I think, are social organisations which are not fixed entities. And Richard Florida himself says that place exerts a powerful influence over our ability to lead happy and fulfilled lives, which I think is a slightly far too fatalistic idea. It's not place. We create place. We make these places, and humans at the moment are playing second fiddle to the places that they inhabit. And the final thing on community, I'm reminded that exactly 30 years ago, Prince Charles, remember him, called for a new community to be developed that will engender a sense of pride where community values are sacrosanct. And he said everyone ought to contribute to the planning and organisation of such urbanism. Then came the Localism Act as a direct consequence. Everybody laughed at Prince Charles at the time. But now you find that kind of paternalism has been absorbed by planners and politicians alike. And these days, contemporary architecture is forcing social solidarity into existence, and more worryingly, it condemns those people who don't conform within those communities. So I think I agree on general terms that we need good, well-designed, well-built, affordable, more housing. But I think that requires a political vision rather than a technical assertion of numbers. And it will also cause disruption to people's lives to do that, but for the greater good. If your starting point is not breaking eggs, nothing's going to happen. Thank you very much.
So thanks very much to the speakers for opening remarks. I'd like to ask, if possible, for the speakers to respond to each other now. So you have about 5 minutes to reflect on each other's presentations. Start with Simon.
Okay. One of the things we do at ASH is we we propose alternatives to the demolition and redevelopment of council estates. And far from being NIMBYs or naysayers or anti-modernists or anti-progressives, we've come up with solutions which we have costed and which keep these communities together, which expand them and develop them. And we've been doing this for 3 years. We've done it on 6 estates. And so far, we've had almost zero success. Our proposals are part of the campaign. But what we're up against, and this is my side of what I generally do within our organisation, is to try and combat these narratives, which I think Austin has just given us a very good sort of summary of. The reason I spent so much of my 15 minutes speaking quoting these figures is to show that in opposition, or it's distinct from these kind of abstract narratives of progress, what is actually happening from the building programme in the UK, which is being pursued primarily through estate demolition, not exclusively, but primarily, particularly in inner London, is not leading to this kind of halcyon utopia of progressive buildings, that it's leading precisely to the kind of social ills which social housing was created to combat. So I'm afraid I think you've given a very good summary of the kind of things that we read in newspapers, that architectural practices tell residents when they're trying to explain why they have to kick them out of their homes, and which councils talk about all the time. I think it's very important that we don't get caught up with these abstract narratives, and that we actually look at what's going on. Stop looking at the future about what we're promised is going to happen when we build these 1 million homes over the next 5 years. Look at what's going on exactly now. And hopefully the kind of figures that I quoted at you, if you took some of them in, can see what is actually driving this so-called modernising programme. It's got absolutely nothing to do with taking people out of their terrible poverty and all these associations that people have, these stereotypes about people who live in council estates, that they are suffering from mental illnesses and they're trapped in their potty traps and all these sort of things, which is really a pure propaganda. We know because we work with these communities and we study on them. And what it's actually driven by is the kind of profit margins that come from these new developments.
Did you want to respond to Matthew at all?
Matthew, I want to support him what he's doing. I think it's great. I think Matthew is, from sounds of what you've been doing, I know some of the campaigns you're talking about. I think the activism, I think I really liked what you said at the end about this idea that activism is very reactive. You're constantly sort of trying to build up walls where you've got these bulldozers coming in. And housing activism, for a long time, has been sort of stuck in that place, quite understandably. And I think it's very important that we make alternative proposals. This is one of the things that Ash is very involved in doing. We don't go, no, don't demolish this estate. We go, we've got other plans for that estate. And even with the estates that we don't design for, but the ones we go and advise to, we'll always say, come up with an alternative. Don't just go no, say yes, say no, we're not going to do what you're doing, because you're going to destroy our community, and you're going to build homes that nobody's going to live in anyway, but come up with some alternative. And I think it's very important that housing activism, or activism in general, doesn't get stuck in this very reactive kind of position that it has, I think, and starts coming up with a bigger kind of plan.
So yeah, I'd just like to... I very much agree with a lot of what you have said, but in particular to what you've mentioned about the importance of housing and good housing conditions over sort of the keeping together of communities and the lack of displacement of people. I agree. You do have to crack a few eggs to solve this issue. As I think historically we've seen the greatest sort of rebuilding and of housing and improvement of living conditions in the UK happened after World War II, after this mass destruction of what was already there, after mass destruction of industry. Only through that could we radically give people, toilets in their houses for the first time, and proper heating, and proper social housing. But currently, I think it's of vital importance to keep communities together, because, quite frankly, I think the greatest egg to crack is capitalism itself. If we want to solve this crisis altogether, if we want to improve from the position we've got today with the welfare state, this system needs to be brought down. It's impossible to solve this crisis without doing so first, and therefore fighting displacement of people and fighting displacement of and separation of already existing communities and already existing bonds, I think is of vital importance, because that is what builds in the end the mutual aid, the solidarity, and to an extent the class consciousness of people, and creates these grassroots ideas and grassroots campaigns and grassroots struggles, which not only keep together communities and help keep what has already been won, but also is what is fighting for the future and what is eventually going to help us progress. So I agree that the very much practical solution to housing and improving and like solving the housing crisis in the UK when it eventually happens needs to, you know, not say look at gentrification and like look at improving areas as something that's inherently dirty, but I think it is very justified to look at it that way whilst we're still living under this form of governance and living under a capitalist economic system.
Well, you know, I'm a anti-capitalist like the next person. I'm a Leninist. I mean, I think that it's very important that we challenge the system. The question is how you do it. What's the approach to it? So, in the spirit of anti-sectarian taking it on the chin, I will say to Simon that maybe I didn't explain myself very well, because, you know, I'm not repeating these things and saying that the private developers are the bee's knees. Matter of fact, they are, I agree with you, arseholes, right? I mean, they're part of the problem. And I know what they're doing it for, and they're not doing it for the common good. However, what I am trying to say is that it's a little bit like, I don't know, the aid debate or something, right? I mean, this may be a controversial, stupid point to throw into the conversation and get me even more enemies. But I would say that, you know, there is a immediate necessity to give aid to people starving in the third world, while at the same time many people recognise that by giving aid makes people reliant on aid and doesn't allow, you know, human flourishing or even capitalist flourishing in the way that might otherwise happen. And so I get it. I endorse it. I mean, I think what you're doing is incredible, right? However, from my political perspective, I think that, you know, there needs to be somebody arguing also at the same time that there are certain limitations to that argument which reinforce, as you say, can almost reinforce the same problem, which I would like to stand above. Yes. So, I mean, there's a very famous book called The Soul of London by Ford Madox Ford, where he basically says, in terms of progress, we wouldn't move further forwarder, very Victorian archaic language, but we wouldn't move any further forward if we were to look at the minutiae of everybody's miserable life. Yes, we have to have a broader social vision about what's required, and that distance can seem quite Daily Mailish, can seem quite, you know, unappealing to deal with the misery of ordinary people's poverty, but at the same time somebody has to do it. So I'm saying that if we don't challenge the philosophy of restraint, if we don't challenge in many ways the sustainability motif, which argues that we shouldn't do things in case it causes problems, that we look as risk aversion as a model for the way we live our lives, of limitations, then we're never going to have future forward vision. Our vision is always tunnel vision rather than 360-degree vision today. And I think that's kind of problematic for having a broad vision of how you solve, you know, any crisis, let alone the housing crisis. I would only then say, just to add to that, as a fillip, is that you said, I don't know whether it was a throwaway line that you kind of, maybe I misunderstood, but you said we have more housing than we need. And I'm always worried about that idea. I don't know what that means. Because I think we need more housing, we need better housing, we need a revisitation of existing housing, making it, you know, better. The standard of technology, the standard of aspiration today is not what it was 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, and therefore I think we need to revisit our housing and have a constant rebuilding of what we need. So I don't know what, you know, need and desire are two very distinct things, and I'm much more in the desire camp than this kind of, you know, let's live with what we need. We don't need holidays. but they're bloody nice things. Yeah. Sorry, I finished there.
Okay, so that's great. Thanks for the replies. If the audience doesn't mind, I'm going to try and take the liberty of asking the first question. So it's been a really interesting conversation so far, and there's something of a debate emerging between Simon and Austin. I don't want to leave Matthew out of the conversation, but just for a moment, I actually think there's some interesting points of agreement that might be able to be found between Simon and Austin. But before anyone asks a question that might look to that, I do want to bring up something that I feel is a bit of a sort of elephant in the room of the conversation so far, which is the question of the state. It's perhaps more associated with anarchism today, but the kind of smashing of the state, the overthrow of the state is absolutely a concept going right back from Marx and has been central to Marxists' revolutionary practice for a long time. Even as far back as the 1980s, Marxists were more aware, I'd say, of this imperative to overcome the capitalist state. And the question of social housing fitted into that with anti-capitalist critiques of social housing. So I was wondering if you guys could reflect on the question of the state and its relevance to leftist politics today regarding housing and more generally, the question of the state, I suppose.
After you.
Yeah. I guess, maybe I can cover this. One of the things we do when we, in ASH, when we try to tell people what it's like to live on an estate, to combat these kind of stereotypes about them, that they are places of crime, that they are places of drug dealing, that they are subsidised by the state. I take from your analogy with overseas aid that there's a very strong myth that social housing is subsidised by the state. It was initially. Almost every post-war estate has paid off its cost of build and its debt many, many years ago. What is subsidised by the state, this is the point I'm trying to get to, is the various state subsidies that are going to the development programme, which resulted in the things like Help to Buy, like Right to Buy, like Buy to Rent, all these enormous quantities of money going from the state out of our pockets into these private developments. I would actually say that one of the great motivations to builders at the moment and developers is getting money from the state to build so-called affordable housing, which is almost all private, for private sale now anyway. So certainly in the terms of housing, the division between private and public doesn't really exist anymore. There is almost zero provision for something called social housing at the moment at all. Everything that the political parties are promising is for affordable housing, which is overwhelmingly now for shared ownership, and that again is subsidised as well. So one of the things we try to talk about is a kind of a third space, I guess, between these two very kind of indistinct sources of revenue, the public and the private. And that is the space of community, which we kind of talk a lot about, which rather than being, I think, something which is retrogressive, which is kind of inward-looking, which is something kind of under threat, and which is kind of hiding away and doesn't want to be changed, which is how Austin's kind of characterised it. I think the focus on community and the creation of community is one of the most progressive forces, I think, that's come out of the, if you want to call it, the housing movement, or certainly for the struggle, the activism to struggle to save housing. States that we've worked with have actually said to us that since they were built in the 70s, when everyone kind of moved into these extraordinarily progressive images of how people live together. That's the thing about these post-war housing. Nowadays, housing is really property, it's real estate, which is worth an amount of money. The housing that is being demolished at the moment by our councils and redeveloped into deposit boxes in the sky, these estates really had a vision, a very progressive vision of the social. They are not simply collections of boxes that people live in. It was about creating community. And those estates took several decades, I think, to actually find out how to live at the communities there, how to live together. I think that's something that we should be recovering, not in a reactionary way, not in a kind of a scared way, but actually trying to promote. And I think the kind of housing that we can build now, or we should be building, should be about promoting community, a space of resistance to this collapse between the public and the private, and something which tries to recreate a different space, the space of community. And as I think the kind of activism that Matthew's kind of involved in, the reason it's found such an echo across the country, and particularly in London, is not simply a reaction to people being threatened with losing their homes, but also because of our desperate need to find a space of community which is neither subject to the kind of ravages of capital, but also not to the kind of corruption of the public sphere. After working for 3 years with Ash and trying to deal with the councils in this country, which unfortunately a lot of people still seem to think are on their side, that you won't find anyone who's got a lower opinion of public life than myself.
Yeah, I'm actually quite glad you wrote this topic. Personally, as an anarchist, if you hadn't already guessed by my lack of eloquency and bad smell, reading, yeah. I do think there is a dual struggle to get rid of capitalism and the state together, and one cannot simply go without the other. If you look particularly at the work of people like such as Kropotkin and more recently David Graeber, they've very much done research into how markets and states cannot exist one without the other. You increasingly see that wherever you have a state, there will also be a market, and in my opinion, markets are in the end what inevitably cause housing shortages, housing crises, bad conditions within housing. Even within so-called socialist societies, such as, be very careful about what I call socialist societies. I know it's a big debate within the left. But say in East Germany, where the state controlled the housing and the housing sector, yet there was still, to some extent, a market. It was still a tool of repression by the state to see who could get housing, and there was still a very prominent housing activist scene. There was a lot of squatting and this sort of thing, because simply even the state and a socialist owned sector couldn't solve this crisis, couldn't deal with the issues of housing, and still had its own interests at heart, which ultimately led to this crisis being continued. And even though there was more than enough social housing for people, people still were left without homes. People were still left with homes which weren't sufficient to their familial needs. So therefore, I do think that it's very necessary to smash the state, as it was put in the question, alongside capitalism, if we are going to solve the housing crisis, as quite simply, like I mentioned, markets and states coincide together and exist together. But in terms of social housing, and right now, and social housing as a temporary solution to the problems we see within housing and see within housing under statism and under capitalism, I think we have to be very careful. We have to acknowledge the benefits of social housing, acknowledge that they are far better than the alternatives, even though there, like was you mentioned, there's increasingly lack of distinction between the private and social sphere. Even those houses which are owned by the councils can very easily be sold off to development companies, can very easily be transferred over in right-to-buy schemes if governments wish to put them forward. So we have to see these as social housing as a solution, but albeit a temporary one, and one that is reversible, and one that we have to really work hard to maintain if we want to see it, continue to exist as a temporary solution under capitalism. But also just want to put put forward very quickly that social housing is not just a state solution. Social housing can very much exist under sort of a stateless society, and I think quite often when we think of social housing and think of the way we organise it, we only see it as what has been done before and very much within the environment and atmosphere which capitalism and statism puts us under. And therefore we need to rethink how we view social housing and how we act out social housing campaigns, and how we can bring in ideas from outside this atmosphere and outside this environment, which maybe you could argue the conditions are not ready for, or the environment's not ready for, but we still need to sort of think outside of the tunnel vision that I think we're currently seeing, which you briefly mentioned earlier, albeit at another point.
Thank you very much. Segue. Yeah. Okay, once again, I apologise if I'm not explaining myself as well as maybe I ought to. My bizarre shift to African aid example wasn't meant to be talking about state support or state subsidy. It was mainly looking at what invigorates agency, what creates the subject, the active subject in history. And I think that's the key we have to try to address if we're ever trying to build a socialist movement, any movement, right? We're going to try and overthrow the state, or if you're just trying to do something on a small scale, activist level, how do you overcome that general, whether you want to call it timidity, or the inability to break out of embryonic class consciousness? How do you transform that? Obviously, a Leninist perspective is through vanguardism, what you may or may not kind of have any truck with, but in general terms, the idea that you have to go beyond yourself is what I'm trying to say. And if you are constantly being, formed into small groups, and localism becomes a central feature of your life, then I think that in some ways, philosophically, as well as politically, but not activistly, actually is a restraint on you. Now, I have to say, it's a bit like, Marx writing about the family, still lived in one in some respects. So there's something nice about families, there's something nice about communities. I get it, right? I get it. As a matter of fact, in today's society, I think we need to have much more active communities. I think we need to stop kind of things that are happening on the streets. We've lost and we become individuated rather than and fragmented rather than anything necessarily with genuine solidarity. So creating solidarities, I'm all for it. I think the only thing I would say is that in terms of the table here is that I'm not going to do it. And I applaud it, right? I applaud it, but it's not. In some ways, I do think it's part of a broader problem, and if we concentrate on that, we avoid or we shift away from what I think is the bigger problem to be addressed, and I'm sure that Simon and Matthew think the opposite. But but I'm not going to do that. I'd rather use my energies to try and raise a kind of a political critique of the culture of limits and the way that we generally socially see the world. That's my thing. I think that in terms of Brexit, I voted Brexit because I'm a Democrat. Yes, and so it's a bit like these things where if we're against the state, which I am, what can I say? But obviously there's the nation state, which I think is a bit more progressive in a democratic tradition than the European superstate or unelected authority and technocrats. So on that level, are you going to condemn me for supporting the state, or are you going to see it as a necessary kind of fillip to go further forward? The idea of representative democracy, I'm against parliamentary talking shops and all the corruption that goes with it. However, I recognise that it's at the moment, if it's under attack, there's something in it which needs to be defended and held dear. So that's where I come from. So it's not necessarily a kind of a pro or anti-state. Fundamentally, deep down, of course, I'm anti-state. I'm a anti-capitalist. I'm a communist. But I mean, the point being is that at today's, we have to understand the era and the problems in which we live today. There are very local, immediate problems of poverty, of homelessness, and I mean the disgrace of homelessness is quite staggering, right? And people who want to be involved and help with that, I completely endorse and I get it. I think for me there's a real problem of if we accept a culture of limits, then we're never going to build any more houses because fundamentally it's kind of, there's a culture of limits. So that's what I want to try and tackle. So it's maybe we're slightly tangential, but hopefully we're on the same ballpark. Round of
Okay, so
applause.
I'm going to start taking some questions, but I want to take them one at a time just to start with. So Richard's had his hand up for quite a while.
So I found this a very interesting discussion. Thank you. So I'm not familiar directly so much with London and the UK, but I'm familiar with North America, so a lot of my knowledge is be drawn from New York and Chicago. In New York, I imagine is similar to London. So two things. One, short of overthrowing the state and expropriating the bourgeoisie, I'm sort of curious what sort of political transition demands could be made. For example, things like rent control. And I guess like what I'd like is sort of more of an explanation of the process that's been going on, I would say, the last 30, 40 years. Because certainly in New York, and I assume it's similar in London, New York was a much more affordable city in the 50s, 60s, and 70s than it's become. And the process of it becoming unaffordable has accelerated. And it's not because now we have capitalism and then we didn't. So even within capitalism, there has been some recent or relatively recent change over the last generation. And I don't quite understand that. And I know that in a place like New York, which is not typical of the whole United States, that most people, obviously there's financialization and super rich people, but most people who live in New York or London are not rich. So at some level, this must be affecting the ability of capitalism. You would think it would affect the ability of capitalism itself to function. I mean, you still need workers to work in these cities, and there's a maximum amount that they can just pay in rent. And in places like New York, I know that the cost of housing has gotten so high, it's affecting not only working class and middle class, but even people one would have thought were upper middle class people who are finding it impossible to buy what they would have expected they could buy. And then I wanted just to ask one question also about gentrification, which I think is an interesting question. So one neighborhood in Chicago that I'm familiar with, and many other people will be familiar with, is Pilsen, which was a working class Mexican neighborhood, and it's been rapidly gentrifying because there's nice housing stock and it's convenient. And of course, it's the tension between the white gentrifiers and the locals, which has a racial ethnic component. But there's also a clear division among the people who live there based upon whether or not they own their house, right? So if you own your house and you're a Mexican person, then you actually welcome the white gentrifiers because it raises the property value of your own property. Whereas if you're renting, then it's just going to drive up your rent and make it unaffordable for you to live there. So it's a kind of class split within the same ethnic community. So my question is, would you be in favor of policies that would encourage broader home ownership, or would you consider those conservative policies?
That Engels text about the housing question, he starts off by saying, this is nothing new. The working class have always lived in appalling housing conditions. What makes it new, he's talking about the 1870s, is that it's now begun to affect the middle classes. And that's kind of what you refer to now, that things are getting so bad that these cities are almost not becoming places where people live and work. They are becoming, investments. They're becoming investments for international capital.
But doesn't that create problems ultimately for the capital?
I think it does. I mean, we went to a conference in New York, which had people from Canada, from Paris, from New York, and from London. We were from London, and also we know that similar things are going on in Australia. So we're kind of eager to distinguish between what is clearly a global phenomenon within capitalism in these major cities, but also what makes London, particular anyway. Because what we got a sense of from talking to these people is that London is kind of further along this particular housing crisis, and they were very interested in looking. The New York guy said that mostly the issue of social housing over there, or public housing, is about how to refurbish it, how to maintain it, how to stop all bloody stuff from falling down, because it's had so much maintenance is being withheld from it. They hadn't got to the point where we are now, which is not about gentrification at all. What is happening into London at the moment has got nothing to do with gentrification, I think. Sometimes you have gentrifying effects in general, but what's happening to London at the moment is social cleansing. These are not being gentrified, these neighbourhoods. They're simply being cleared out. And what's being built there is they're not as housing. In my talk I call them properties. It's not about housing. To answer your question, so I didn't go on forever, I think rent caps is obviously a very, very important thing. It's something they've got in Germany, but of course we never copy that. It seems to me that the UK always looks at what is worst in the world, and they go, we'll have some of that. What we're doing at the moment is we're trying to recreate London very much on the model of Paris. Parisian social housing is generally in the banlieue, and they kind of dump all their immigrants there, and then they bring them into work in the centre, and then they kick out again. And we've seen over the last few years what kind of social contract that kind of leads to. What we're having in London is very different, because we had public housing or council housing earlier. A lot of London public housing is right in the centre of the city now. So you've got to get those people out, and that's what's driving it. I don't think gentrification is an accurate word to describe what's happening in London at the moment. Certainly not in relation to the enormous global phenomenon of money coming from capital from around the world to be invested in inner London housing. That's happening because of the political acquiescence, if you like, the kind of the laws that we run, which allow that to happen and not to be taxed. London housing or London properties are one of the most stable politically commodities in the world, and also one of the greater, or has been over the last decade, the most increasing in value commodities as well. And that, I think, is not something you can describe as gentrification. We never use that word, or generally almost never.
Social cleansing and theft.
Matthew, did you want to answer one of the two questions?
So yeah, I think you make some really good points. You mentioned quite a lot, so I'll just sort of try and keep it down to certain things. In what you've mentioned about sort of how this is harming the capitalists, harming the people who are doing this, I think it's true. But in the end, that's because capitalism is illogical, even for the capitalists. They do this to create capital and the pursuit of capital. But in doing so, they further marginalise workers. When you push out workers to, further zones, move people who work in Zone 1 and move them out to Zone 6 or whatever, that decreases productivity, which decreases the amount of capital they can create. But in the short term, it does help the capitalists. So that's why they do it. It's not a sense that, capitalism and the capitalists are very logical and that they're purposely planning to, socially cleanse and gentrify these areas in order to long-term sustain their wealth and to help them in the long term continue to create capital. They're doing it very much in the short term, very much from a tunnel vision. And it's benefiting no one, and it is a problem systemic to the capitalist society. But it also, in terms of what you mentioned on home ownership, I think that's a really good point. I do think that it is important to, while we still have social housing and rents, that we do put in rent controls and that we do try and limit the damage that states and capitalism put on specifically the working class. But I think encouraging home ownership is incredibly important, but it's also a very sensitive issue, and we have to be very careful how we do it. And we've got to make sure that if we encourage home ownership, it's got to be universal. It's not just encouraging home ownership for certain parts of, or certain classes or certain parts of the class, for the upper working class, rather than maybe the, casualised worker. It's got to be encouraged home ownership for all, and you have to ensure that the system that you put in place gives the ability for all to have home ownership. Otherwise, there will continue to be an exploitation and continue to be a separation of interests within the working class between those who own their homes and those who don't. But yeah, ultimately, I think home ownership is a very good thing, and I think it does increase community support and does empower people and does allow for the working class to take back more control and to take back greater ownership of their lives in general.
Did I trample over your applause? Sorry. You want to applaud me? I haven't got that much to add. I don't think. I think I kind of agree with what's been said. I would only say that the model that's being proposed, and I think Simon's right, that there's a kind of a bourgeois architect conversation happening over here about what should happen, and then there's a reality on the ground. And if you read the architect's press, the big discussion is on collective Soviet-style living for upper middle class creatives to dine in the collective restaurant, or there's increasing the rental sector, and again that's kind of premised, I think. Well, I know from the discussion about sustainability, which is that we should never buy carpets anymore. We should rent them. Yes, we shouldn't buy chairs. We shouldn't buy anything anymore. We should always rent because it's a transient relationship, and you can hand them back, and they can be turned into something more useful. So that idea about using a property in the same way, where we now just rent it and see ourselves as a transient migrant community, doesn't allow us, I think, to then set down those very community roots that other members of the panel have been speaking about more fully. So I do think that there's something about home ownership which gives you a stake and a value in a place and a property. But I'm not here necessarily to defend it or to say that it's great or bad. People do it for 1,000,001 reasons, whether it's for inheritance or whether it's for making money where they can't make anywhere else. It's very interesting to see that in Wales the right to buy has been banned. No, they've stopped it. And you could say that's a good thing, anti-Thatcherite kind of politics. But in some ways, the reason for doing it is because they're not building any more, and therefore they want to eke out a little bit more use from the existing infrastructure. It's a little bit like that accident that happened on the motorway a couple of months ago, where they're turning the hard shoulder into an additional lane. Yeah, so instead of building more roads, you just say, look, we've got this hard shoulder, nobody's using it, why don't you drive on it? And of course, somebody parked on it and got ran into. So the thing is that if you say, I'm not going to build any more infrastructure, but we're going to use it much more efficiently by, when you go to work, somebody else will go and sleep in your bed, then there's an efficiency to that, and there's a communitarian kind of harmony to that. But I do think that there's something slightly negative about this whole discussion. So for me, it is about more. It is about providing more and better, rather necessarily than maybe how we purchase it or how we use it.
Okay, questions. Well, okay. Can we take
quicker
one
in our
from,
answers?
is it
Am I talking a long
so
time?
much I would like to say, but I will
Can you
obviously
keep it
try and
fairly
keep it short. I'll go very quickly through. In fact, I'll start on your last point about building more motorways, for example. In the 70s, there was a big campaign around this concept of induced demand, which was everyone was thinking, oh great, you build more motorways, make them bigger, and you'll reduce traffic. In fact, what they saw happen was exactly the opposite. You actually create demand and you increase traffic. And this is exactly what we're seeing happening in the debate around housing supply and demand. We say, the places where we're building more is increasing the demand for those in those areas. The places where we're reducing is reducing demand. So this is again, which is about trying to unpick this narrative around supply and demand, and the idea that the market will supply, will be able to satisfy supply through demand, which I think is fundamentally flawed. The second thing, this idea you mentioned, this relationship between gentrification as being some kind of social progress. I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what gentrification is. Gentrification is the displacement of one social class with another. It's not that social class becoming. It's not working classes becoming middle class. That's not what gentrification as a process is, in my understanding of it. And I think that's really, really important to understand these different terminologies really precisely, because otherwise we're using words which really aren't meaning what we want them to mean. And I think that obviously comes back to your point about gentrification and what we're terming here as sort of social change, because they are different processes, I think, that are kind of going on. And then just quickly, just talking about different forms of ownership. And I think there are new forms of ownership which we're seeing coming through, which are collective ownership. Things like housing cooperatives. And housing cooperatives aren't necessarily like I think you were describing, the kind of the sort of posh middle classes, sipping their lattes in CLT, in community land trusts, which definitely is a kind of a phenomenon. But housing cooperatives are traditionally, came out of the squatting movement, traditionally much more working class communities, and they are they're in abundance, not as much in the UK as in places like Germany, obviously, where like 30% of the housing in Germany is provided by alternative forms of collective living. And I think in the UK, we're certainly supportive of some of the council estates that we're working with who are wanting to take collective ownership of their estate, which wouldn't necessarily mean they were coming out of public ownership. They could be collectively owned and managed. One of the estates we work with is a cooperatively managed but it's still in public ownership. So that has a very different relationship of the residents of that estate to the management of their homes. And I think there's many, many different forms of collective living and ownership which aren't the very, very sort of split divide between the public and the private. And I'll stop there.
Austin, did you have a response to that?
Sorry, I keep on trampling people's applause. Yes, well, I used to work for a housing cooperative a long time ago, and let me tell you, it wasn't a pleasant experience for them as well as me. No, it was. It might be, the halcyon interpretation of what a housing cooperative would be, but obviously they took on all the housing that was sold off by the councils. That was their initial kind of boost in the 80s, and they didn't provide, as far as I'm aware. I worked in Sunderland and Newcastle and in Middlesbrough. And there's nothing to write home about, I don't think. I think the discussion about using words that we want them to, that you said we must use words the way we want them to mean. True, but maybe you want it to mean slightly different to what maybe I want it to mean, because as I said, gentrification is a term which is a boo word which cannot possibly now be used positively. Yes, I can't say I'm in favour of gentrification, you throw me out, right? I mean, there's something. I'm not in favour of gentrification, by the way. Right? But I'm saying let's not kind of over-egg this, right? There are some benefits to improving an area, which I think most people recognise on the ground as it happens. And in terms of words, I really have a problem with social cleansing, right? Because that really is dangerous. This is not Mussolini. Right? This is something of, fair enough. Poor people are being moved out of areas. Migrants, immigrants are being shipped to Bradford and pissed about all over the country. I get it, right? Call it what it is, but it's not social cleansing. It's not some kind of fascistic state mechanism. And if we use those terms like that, then we're really in dangerous territory, and we kind of muddy the water between, and evictions and the Holocaust. And this is something which I really feel strongly about. So, I get what you're saying. In some ways, I don't think we're necessarily on a different wavelength completely, but I think maybe we're on different sides about how we achieve it, or what the priorities are we place on it.
Matthew, or Simon?
Yeah. I think what you're saying about gentrification is very true, and that any form of improvement in an area which sort of comes from the top up is never going to benefit the local community. It's never going to be a sustainable improvement for the people who live there and for presumably the working people who live there. And although we shouldn't, disregard all improvements to areas and improving conditions, if that is going to occur, it has to come from those communities themselves. It has to be a grassroots movement. It has to go from bottom up, because ultimately that's the only way that those interests are going to be protected in the long term. So therefore, I wouldn't say, I'll disagree with you in saying that gentrification or whatever we see as improving an area, however you want to describe it, doesn't have to be seen as something dirty all the time. Under the pretext of capitalism and under the context of society which we live in, and the way in which these improvements often put out in practice, it is almost always wrong, almost always not in the interests of the working people. And we sort of need to build a culture around grassroots movements, not just fighting these improvements, but also, like you mentioned earlier, giving counter improvements, giving counter schemes, which are genuinely going to improve these areas for people.
I don't know. Maybe I'll wait till.
I saw Cam in the very corner had his hand up for a while.
This has been a very interesting discussion, and I find it particularly relevant because I live in an apartment building in Toronto, and they're building a 25-story apartment building right next to it. So instead of a view of the lake, I'm going to have a view of the apartment. So I think about these issues essentially every day when I walk by it. That kind of leads me to think about, when we talk about these issues, we talk about policy and we talk about what's happening, and it's always someone else who's acting. So I think of it being kind of like one of the fundamental issues with gentrification, or whatever you want to call it, is about how people experience change. So like the city I'm from, after World War II, they bulldozed all the slums and social housing. And it wasn't considered a negative thing because this, Dickensian urban squalor was replaced by clean, relatively nice housing. And there was a sense of popular participation in that they were building, this post-war welfare state. But now, when these sort of changes happen, I don't think there's the same sort of sense of participation. People aren't acting, they're acted upon by these forces that are just completely beyond control. And I think in terms like disruption and so on, like that is just the way that people experience social change now, is as being just the force of these kind of abstract, larger interests, put their...
What's your question?
Don't you agree?
No, but the question back is, so why is that? Why don't you answer it?
Why people don't feel they...
Yeah, don't repeat your own question. Yeah.
I think, okay, I'll try. I do support and use this term social cleansing, which of course is referring to the term ethnic cleansing, because it clarifies that this is not about gentrification. Gentrification was a term coined in the 60s by sociologists who lived in Islington, who noticed that after the exodus from London during the 50s of the middle classes, suddenly everyone was like, wow, there's all these beautiful Victorian and Georgian houses all over London. We can pick them up for nothing. And they slowly went to move in. Some of you might have seen that wonderful series, The Secret History of Our Streets, which talked about precisely that. And those so-called slums, which were sort of demolished in Deptford, are now going for like several million quid and stuff. Architecture doesn't create poverty. Poverty creates bad architecture. Those things which were, knocked down as slums by GLA people in the in the 60s and stuff, and then built social housing on top of it, they're now going for a fortune. There's no equivalence. Our current state regeneration national strategy, which was created by David Cameron, and which is now being exported across the whole of the UK, is based on the idea that social housing, this type of architecture, is endemic to kind of poverty. To answer your question, gentrification is a gradual process. And you might argue that when investment is brought into an area, it will kind of, maybe there'll be, it will kind of trickle down. It's all kind of trickle-down theory of capitalism. That if you move some middle-class people into a working-class area which is impoverished, capitalism will bring more money into it and their lives will go up. There'll be some losses, but there'll also be some sort of balances. That's not what's happening at the moment. As you said yourself, people are being acted upon. They are being cleaned out of an area. As Geraldine said there, gentrification is this kind of this slow-moving kind of like, if you like, mixing between classes of money going into an area. That's not what's happening now. People are being moved out wholesale. They don't come back. There are 230 estates which are undergoing, threatened with, or have undergone some form of regeneration leading to a loss of social housing. Almost always it's demolition and then redevelopment in London alone. And that is going to increase. The kind of figures that are going round about being... Let me give you an idea. In Southwark, where you're doing your campaign, the number of homes for social rent which are being lost to current and the next prediction of the Old Kent area, opportunity area, is 9,500 homes. That's in one borough. And there is not a single borough in London which doesn't have an estate regeneration programme. You can add up these figures. These people are moved out. They're not gentrified, they are kicked out. And that's why they feel they're being acted upon. And that's why they use this term social cleansing, because they're being clean, they're not being gentrified.
Austin, did you want to respond to the question about agency?
Well, I wanted him to reinforce my speech. I think that... you're right in the way you phrase the question, yes, from my point of view, that people are acted upon rather than acting upon their situation. Now, the question then is that an individualistic response, community response, or a social issue? And you can take it on many levels. I think that in order to act upon that situation, you can pragmatically say, this is the one condition, this house is being built, this is blocking my view, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to lobby and campaign and get it stopped. You could either do that through protest, campaigning against the developer. You can do it by lobbying the local authority. All that's kind of interesting activism. And, in some ways, training people into doing that, the Jane Jacobs school of, bourgeois thought is kind of is fine by me, right, as a starting point, embryonic understanding. I do find in some ways there's an anti-democratic element to some of these protests, where rather than having out the political conversation, there's much more internal lobbying and hooting horns in local authority meetings to try and get things stopped, or even what's gone on in the Haringey discussion is up for discussion as to how democratic that conversation was. But for me, the broader issue would be, how do you really create a sense of agency, not individual action, the ability to act on a situation, but the ability to see yourself as an active agent of historical change, so that it goes beyond the local and you see something more social, which is why I obviously there's a difficult scenario where that community might be drawn. Yes.
And can I ask why?
Why what?
Why is this so important? Can you say a little bit?
Because I'm interested in politics. Yes.
I think you're talking about abstractly about what we could do.
Yeah.
We need to look at what is happening now.
You can do that, right? So that's what I'm saying. That's where my example of aid comes in, right? Practically saving lives on the ground, starving in Africa. Somebody has to go in there and feed them, right? And I respect that. But I don't think it actually helps the development of Africa to resolve that in the future.
Matthews, do you have a view on this debate?
And
the agency question?
Well, in terms of the question asked, I'll keep it short and snappy because there's a lot of things to talk. But I think the reason people are experiencing these issues differently and experiencing the way they're being acted upon differently is because, in general, our experience with capitalism as a force has changed rapidly in the past couple of decades. I think the globalization of capitalism has created a much greater lack of engagement, a much greater sort of lack of community, a much greater, sense of just sort of disillusionment and bending over by people, particularly within housing, where it's so easy now to just bulldoze communities and to ship foreign investors in to basically empty out areas and just keep these homes as well. So I think when we look at why people's experiences with these things are changing, we need to look at it within a greater scheme also. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
We've got a question from Mr. Corbyn for a while.
I'm Piers Corbyn, brother of, but I am speaking on my own behalf. I would like to point out that in 1968 I was there, and I don't think anyone else here was there. And we were the action. And what 68 brought us, and I think that maybe some of you ought to talk about at some point, is student occupations, squatting, workers' occupations, and so forth, which were massive. We had a discussion about it
last night, actually. So
okay. Sorry.
Yeah, you weren't there, were you?
And after we got rehoused from Elgin Avenue, having 200 of us from the barricades, the GLC 3 years later was forced to give secure tenancies to 10,000 squatters. Right. So the point about it is that we had a programme of action and demands which worked. And what we need now is action and demands. And I'm sorry Simon's gone because I agree with 90% of what he said. I was in the International Marxist Group for a while, where we put forward this truth that the demand for decent housing for all was a revolutionary transitional demand, which means it can't be met under capitalism, but it's still a good thing to do, and it's a very reasonable thing to do. And in terms of the action demands we have now, I've got a list here of things that were agreed by Southwark Group of Tenants, but requisitioning
What's the name of the group? Sorry?
Southwark Group of Tenants organisation, and many others. Requisitioning empty property, rent controls, and so forth, and ballots. Now, I want to say the idea of ballots is good, very, very good, and it's part of accountability, which is good. And carrying on these ideas on demands, you see, we had massive action in Haringey, which has resulted in stopping that evil special purposes destruction of social housing vehicle. And of course, the powers that be don't miss a chance when they're being destroyed to say, oh my God, that is terrible, because developers won't be able to help provide housing anymore. Well, developers are the cause of the problem, right? And what drives them is international capitalist investment. And I want a specific question. In Vancouver, they put forward the idea, and it's been agreed, that they made it illegal to have money laundering developments. Now, if we did that in London, 90% of what you see on the skyline would stop, and that would be fantastic. I just want to end by saying, in the Aylesbury estate, there's still 75% of the estate is there, and we are fighting. 20 years on, and the current rate of development in 50 years' time, which is 50 years ago, they might finish their plan, and I hope Matthew will be here or there to celebrate whatever was achieved then. But some key things have come out of the Aylesbury inquiry recently, namely that the council have admitted that refurbishment would be cheaper than demolition, and they admitted they didn't give the full information to the councillors. In other words, the whole shooting match is wrong. So I just want to end by saying that we have to build a mass movement against social cleansing, and we've got a lot of people involved, and it really is now becoming a movement. And I can't read that. But the key flag that we fly under, if you like, has to be defend the vision which was, put forward in post-war socialising, which it was fantastic, and it still is fantastic. And the alternate state, which would be there, the golden egg of all developers, because it's next to Richmond Park, for example. I mean, the powers that be want to destroy everything good that was created after the Second World War. We have to defend and extend that vision under the banner of decent housing for all at cost. And I have many bits of paper here. Thank you.
Austin, do you want to?
Oh, sorry, I didn't think I was. I thought that was a nice polemic.
Well, you can answer it.
Wait, I had an order. I had Sebastian, the other Sebastian first.
So I wanted to get, because he was rent control was mentioned several times, and for rent caps in Germany don't work. So there are rent caps, but they essentially don't work. The rents are rising. And I wanted to come back to the homeowner question, which was raised, and I thought, isn't renting potentially, doesn't it bear the potential of freedom, because home ownership seems to be a demand which is rather a petit bourgeois character, the concern of the peasant. Yes, tied to his own land. So isn't there a potential in renting?
So anti-home ownership potential, maybe some kind of.
My second question was what about rising wages? Isn't there also a potential organizing workers and others for to raise the wages instead of just controlling the rents?
Okay, those are two really interesting questions, and I would
add on that.
Okay, go on. Add on to that then.
So I live in a city that used to be called Red Vienna. About 100 years ago, a bit less, they start to abolish the housing market. Basically, they just replaced it by massive state buildings. They knew that they will never that this is not socialism. For them, it was a defensive mechanism to defend the city actually against the countryside. But they were quite clear that home ownership itself is not the goal. And on the one hand, normally Red Vienna has this age of nostalgia for the left. But I was kind of surprised that it never got mentioned, because it's the earliest and biggest attempt of the left to change the housing market completely. And it's Vienna is still one of the biggest offers of flats in the world, next to North Korea and Cuba.
So social housing isn't socialism. Social housing isn't socialism, you say?
They were clear about that, but they know that it's like a transitional thing.
Okay.
And like, what's the heritage of that? Because it's
Okay, so 2 or 3 very interesting questions. Who wants to? Yeah.
I'm kind of surprised that you two sort of were in favour of home ownership. I'm very against home ownership. I think that the home ownership encourages you to see what should be something which is a use value turns into an exchange value, and I think the enormous proportion of people living in their own homes in England, even though it's falling under these rising prices compared to European countries, is why our particular housing crisis, and one of the reasons anyway, that it's so bad. It's encouraged also, it's created a whole lot of commodities to people to invest in as well. So I think it's I think home ownership and the encouragement of home ownership by subsequent governments, both Labour and Tory, certainly since Thatcher came in, and the enormous reduction in social housing that's come from that, has not only driven house prices up, it's also driven rental prices up as well. And I think that all comes from seeing homes as commodities. So I'm completely against home ownership. I also like what you said about the idea of I've rented all my life. I couldn't even get dream near to a home I owned. But I actually quite like it. I like the freedom it gives to move around. I think seeing, the things about estates, we fight for the estates not just for the community that's living in now, but the communities that are going to come after them, their children or someone else who goes into them. They are transient things that people move through. There might be people who live on them for 20 years, and sometimes they've got their families who live on the estate and create something like a village. But there's also people moving through it and going out the other side as well. And I think that's the way, I think that's a very positive way to see housing, rather than something that you own from the cradle of the grave and then you pass on to your children or something like that. I think that's a real source of the particular severity of the housing crisis that we've got at the moment. But yes, I also understand this idea of maybe a transitional phase or something like that. But I'm not sure I can comment on that.
Yeah. So in terms of rents and it being freeing, you said I can understand where you're coming from, but I think something we have to understand here is that for the vast majority of people, you are not free when you rent. You literally rent where you can. Especially within London, my friends don't pick where they live. My friend doesn't pick to live in Seven Sisters. I don't pick to live where I live. I live there because it's literally the one place I could find at that very point in time, which I could afford to live by, and only just afford to live by. So I think there is great potential within renting for freedom, but simply under capitalism that never occurs. Is simply impossible. It's not even, I think, transitionally wise. I think it's very, very, very difficult to do. And like you said, rent controls, you can put them in place and you should at least try them, but in practicality, there are ways to get around them. They don't particularly work. We see it in every aspect of regulation and reform of, the housing market. There are ways to get past it if you try hard enough, and the forces in the market will try and do such. And in terms of home ownership, I maybe wasn't clear enough about this. When I give my support, I'm not suggesting sporadic home ownership and simply encourage people to get homes wherever they can, and for home ownership in this very sort of normalised and standardised definition of you buy a home, you live in there your whole life, you pass it down to your kids when you die. I'm more talking about the alternative forms of home ownership that was mentioned earlier, such as like collective ownership, and completely eradicating rental markets within areas by providing homes for the people who live in those areas, and each and every one of them, and not leaving any one of them out. So they have united interests, and it creates a sense of community within those areas, and they can collectively work together and cooperate to make sure that home ownership is not used to exploit anyone in the community, but rather to improve the conditions of the working people who live there. I don't really have much more to add.
Well, I mean, ironically, in London, the rental sector is extortionate. In some ways, people buy houses because the mortgage is cheaper than the rent. So, the distinction for me is not how you pay, it's what is the quality of the goods, use value goods or exchange value goods that you're occupying. So, yes, more good, cheap, affordable, quality, convenient housing, and then how you pay for it obviously we're still talking about under capitalism here, yes, paying for it, rather than some socialist paradise where we don't pay for it, and it's a community good. Then for me the distinction is less, I suppose, less interesting, less important. Ironically, in terms of you make a differential by saying that it increases freedom or a sense of freedom by rental. It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because I think a lot of people buy their houses to give them a certain sense of freedom. The capital, what they might be able to sell to afford somewhere else. Yes. So the idea of renting is a freedom to maybe up sticks at 4 weeks' notice and move somewhere else. That's fine, I get it. But in terms of freedom as a independent agent under capitalism, to maybe say I have £100,000 worth of material here that I can sell off and maybe supplement my non-existent pension, then that's a different type of freedom. So it's horses for courses, I think.
Okay, we're going to have time for one more question basically, and I'm going to ask two different questions. Ask for two questions. One from Lucas and one from.
The question was because we had this point on the panel about this comparison of the housing question with this aid for third world countries or similar things, and I was kind of thinking about this piece by Rosa Luxemburg, Reform or Revolution, and how this was a critique of the Bernsteinian point of making reforms instead of revolution, and she was kind of critiquing that reform and revolution, that they are separated from each other, is already kind of regress of political understanding has undergone in the Second International. And I was kind of thinking, do you see your political action of or your goals in the here and now as connected to the bigger question in socialism or anarchism respectively there? And how are the goals for the here and now connected to this kind of bigger political question? And that's basically my question.
This is actually my question as well, but I wanted to specify it in terms of the short and the long term, because Matthew, you talked about how capitalists sometimes act irrationally because they act on the short term, but maybe don't think for the long term. But this problem is on the left as well, right?
Yeah.
And so perhaps, for example, when we emphasize things like community and we defend small shopkeepers and these kinds of things, it's difficult to see how that develops a class consciousness in this community that then could connect them to the greater struggle for socialism. And yet one might feel as a housing activist that that's the form in which one's resistance or reformist politics must take, while you seem to have a vision of the future that's greater than just defending small shopkeepers. And so I wanted you all to specify if you saw your current practice and the way that you're presenting your your theory and the work that you do as connected, and how is it connected to this revolutionary end, and if the revolutionary end in any way affirms or is in harmony with what Austin sort of presented in the beginning in his presentation as unleashing the forces of production that are in capital for the ends and the needs of humanity, as opposed to just restraining them and sort of playing this defense mechanism that Matthew described.
Yes, you very quickly.
Just add to this, because it's I think the same, to specify a point, because this if you how do you see the housing question or your engagement in the housing question to kind of build up for something? I mean, because it seems that the concrete demands are very local, it's like a neighborhood, it's like a city, it's like concrete politics within your neighborhood. But how does it, where do you see the potential and the possibilities for it to link up to some bigger politics? Because something I noticed also is that rent is a problem, or it seems to be a problem, especially in big urban metropoles. What about the industrialized areas where actually rent goes down and where no one wants to live? Like the area where I come from, the rural community, it's deindustrialized. I mean, you can get a super nice flat, and owner, he pays you $500 to move in and renovates everything because no one wants to live there. So is it not like also like rent concern? Doesn't it concern like sort of urban middle class? Isn't that like an urban middle class concern for people in big cities?
So I think there's the same kind of question coming up 3 times with the more like localist question here, or anti-localist. Pam had more of a specifying of a slightly more historical take on it.
I was just asking about the relationship between your practice and this like end of revolution, whether or not it was about unleashing the productive forces of
and
capitalism.
also, and we're really running out of time, unfortunately, because we have to finish. We're meant to finish on time so that we can start the feminism panel at 2 p.m. in the same room, and people need a break. So I'm sorry to do this, but if you could answer these questions and also integrate that into a kind of summing up remarks, that would be really good. I don't mind which order you go in, but Matthew, you want to go?
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's a very valid point you bring up in terms of how we link these issues to a greater socialist and sort of like revolutionary campaign. And the fact is that these very much in the building of these campaigns, it is the building of activist networks, and it's not just a case of I do this localist movement, and then once that campaign's won, we're finished. It mobilizes communities to rise against greater injustices within the area, and it actually encourages people to start doing things themselves, to start criticizing more aspects of their society, criticizing more aspects of their community, being more critically engaged with themselves. And also, I mean, in terms of personally, my engagement with sort of housing activism is very much as part of a wider struggle. I do these things not because I think the housing crisis is the greatest issue which is faced in society. It's simply part of a grander scheme of work that I do in trying to fight back against capitalism and trying to sort of encourage more people to get involved in actively fighting these things and actively acknowledging what is wrong with society. Because you have people who maybe aren't critical of capitalism, who are getting involved in these campaigns, who through these campaigns you can radicalize and make them become more revolutionary, who then in turn do that to other people. And it is almost like a domino effect. And it is very important to engage with people locally in order for them to be able to engage outside of that also. Because quite frankly, community campaigns are what creates a solid base and give people the confidence to go on and challenge our society in bigger, more radical ways, which relate with the greater scheme of socialism and revolution and all that. And just quickly at the end to put in, if you look back in historical perspectives, so I do a lot of rent strike stuff like I mentioned, and historically rent strikes such as the one in Clydeside in 1914 and the one in Kirkby in the 30s, if I remember that correctly.
In Scotland.
Yeah, Clydeside was in Scotland and Kirkby is just outside Liverpool. They were very much initiated by the women in these areas who had relations to revolutionary socialist groups. And after these rent strikes won, this transpired into something greater and a greater movement against the patriarchy within these areas, and they continued to, advocate revolution and socialism within their areas in a grander way. But without these initial causes, mobilizing them, that simply wouldn't have happened. So I think it's very important that we don't get lost in just trying to reform the system, and we do engage it within a larger, these local campaigns within a larger context, but it's still very much important that we continue these campaigns and don't simply focus on, revolution and only revolution, if that makes sense.
Simon.
Funnily enough, a couple of months ago, I spoke at a panel like this, which I think Austin actually organised, which was called Reform or Revolution. I don't think that's a very. I don't think that's a good way of sort of thinking about what our kind of options are at the moment. Personally, I don't think the revolution is around the corner at all. And I think the discourse of revolution, of we need to do something radical and change things up, is actually put in the service of things like around here. Many of you probably have seen that great big poster of that girl with her hands in the air saying, "The Red Revolution's here, £300 a week," or something like this. It's put towards, I think, this kind of idea of saying, oh, are you going to be a reformist and tinker with things, or are we going to do something really big and really change these things? And I think that discourse of revolution, who's going to say, oh, I'm a reformist? No, I'm a revolutionary. It's being used to promote privatising kind of ideas of sort of, yes, let's kind of chuck everything out, let's demolish these estates and build all these sort of homes. So I don't think it's a very good way necessary to think about it. And the idea that the UK is on the edge of revolution is just not one I buy for a second. On the other hand, something is changing, I think. Housing is something that affects everyone. It's one of these kind of like really big issues that is increasingly, as these kind of figures I quoted, going to affect everyone. In terms of our own practice, when we set up Architects for Social Housing, we're not a political group. We were interested in doing something, in real practical measures. And it came out of, in a sense, that we didn't think the marching and the protests and the banners and even the very, very more practical things like eviction resistance kind of groups, getting up and standing and stuff, it was creating great solidarity and stuff, but they were just getting walked over, and we're still getting walked over, I think. So we're a very practical group in terms of what we're doing. But there is another side to our work, and that is what we call the kind of the counter-propaganda side of it, which is trying to change the understanding of what is driving this housing crisis, what's created it, and above all, being very suspicious of the solutions that are being put forward, kind of going back to what my paper was about. In 2015, when we kind of got into this thing, there were a lot of independent groups really kind of getting things done. People occupying estates, whether it's the Carpenters or the Aylesbury, people getting up to all sorts of antics, and we were really attracted to that scene. We thought it was great, even though there wasn't really a unity amongst it, but it was a collectivity, and people were kind of doing stuff. Now, since then, that scene, in my opinion, has all but disappeared, and it's been taken over by the Labour Party. There's very few housing activists I know who are not also some form of believers in Jeremy Corbyn. And one of the things that we do a lot of, which I personally have become reviled for, is to actually read Labour housing policy and talk about what Labour councils are doing. And I think that kind of that collective independence of activity, or activism, if you want to call it, that we had in 2015, has kind of formed itself into this, I think, incredibly naive and very uninformed belief that if we get Jeremy Corbyn into the government of this country, we're suddenly all going to be okay. And that simply is not going to happen. If you look at the policies, the housing policies of the Labour Party, they now call themselves the party of home ownership, for Christ's sake. Labour councils are the main primary implementers and innovators of estate demolition and redevelopment. I find it very worrying and very it really grounds me down that the Labour Party has so successfully managed to turn this very rebellious kind of anarchist kind of scene in 2015 into people who want to vote for the Labour Party, as if somehow under the people like Novara Media and things like the Spirit of 45 and Paul Mason, with his kind of singing the bloody red flag and stuff, they really kind of, there's this idea that somehow the Labour Party is being transferred into the party of Bevan, and we're all going to build all this stuff. It's just not there. We have to read these policies. So that's one of the things that we do. We try and get people to read these bloody policies and realise that voting the Labour Party is not going to solve other things. I'm not a politician, but in housing policy, what is going on now in estate demolition is a Labour Party policy. There is no split between these so-called Blairite councils and the Corbynites. That just doesn't exist. Read the stuff, read our stuff. We've written piles and piles about it. The other thing we try to do in terms of the long-term kind of idea of what our very concrete action does is we're also trying to change opinions about the role of architects as well. Because at the moment, the architectural profession, without which none of this happens, is completely supine and servile in serving the kind of the builders and stuff. So we're engaged both in a polemic. One of the claim planks is you don't need to demolish these estates to increase housing capacity. But we're also trying to change kind of things ideologically as well, and that's where I get the sense of the longer term kind of and the bigger picture of our very particular kind of practice. Sorry.
Well, as an architect, I take that on the chin. I think,
as well.
literally sometimes. I think that from my point of view, I agree with a lot of what's been said in many ways. From my point of view, what do I do? My activism, it's an intellectual project, I think. It's not necessarily kind of bums on seats or boots on the ground. I think we just have to understand and in some ways challenge some of the orthodoxies. Why are they orthodoxies? Maybe some of the orthodoxies are correct. That's fine. But we have to critique them. So what you're saying, Simon, what you've both said in terms of reading Labour Party policy, let's be honest, I'm not going to tell you to do that, yes? Because you've got better things to do maybe. But I mean, obviously read as much and as widely as you possibly can is what I would advocate. And in some ways there's a lot of discussion about this subject which is not about this subject. You know, we don't talk about housing, we don't read housing manuals to understand what we want to do. We want to talk about politics, we want to read sociology, philosophy, all these kind of things. Academic journals are at the forefront. And I think that part of the deal is that if you want to look at the rise of Malthusianism, for an example, which has come about as a joke philosophy for 200 years and suddenly has been talked about in chattering class discussions and it's become credible, where we blame individuals and too many individuals for the problems of society, that is something that we have to challenge. Because if we accept that, then forget building more houses, because we shouldn't have more houses, we shouldn't have more people, right, to house them in. And that illiberalism, the risk aversion, the lack of experimentation which is about in society today, what has caused the social conditions to allow those reprehensible reactionary philosophies to grow? And I think that's what we need to tackle on an intellectual level. Then when we go on the ground, then we have much more armour to really kind of tackle these things on a first principle basis. So that would be my appeal to you. Read widely, get involved in discussing and this kind of event, and more power to your elbow, whichever way you want to go. Thanks.